The night my mother called me an embarrassment, she made sure my father was on FaceTime so he could hear it too. She stood beside the dresser with her arms folded. My father's face filled the phone screen, and between them, standing barefoot on the carpet in my childhood bedroom, was me, 20 years old, a nursing student, an honors student, a daughter who had done everything she was told. And somehow, according to both of them, I had become the family's biggest disappointment. My mother said I was throwing my future away. My father said someone had put these ideas into my head. My mother said I needed help, professional help. And while they were deciding what was wrong with me, I had already signed the paperwork that would change my entire life. My name is Emily Carter. I was 20 years old the night my parents stopped seeing me as their daughter and started seeing me as their failure. But to understand why I walked away from home before sunrise, you have to understand the kind of family I grew up in. Welcome to Stories of the Unbroken, where the people who survive quietly eventually tell the truth. Before we continue, tell me something in the comments. If your parents forced you into a future you hated, would you stay and suffer, or would you leave? And don't forget to tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read every comment. My father believes hard work fixes everything. He wakes up at 5 every morning, drinks black coffee, pays every bill early, and has spent his entire life believing that if you simply push through pain long enough, eventually it becomes success. My mother believes something else. She believes reputation is everything. She notices who drives what, who married whom, which children became doctors, which children disappointed their parents. The neighborhood mattered, the church mattered, the family image mattered. Sometimes I think I spent my entire childhood being raised by two different fears. My father's fear of failure, my mother's fear of embarrassment. And somewhere between those two fears, I disappeared. I was their only child, the good student, the quiet one, the girl teachers loved, the girl relatives pointed at during family gatherings. Emily's going to do great things. Emily's so smart. Emily's going into medicine. The strange thing about praise is that eventually it becomes a contract. People stop asking who you are. They start telling you who you're supposed to become. I don't remember anyone ever asking me what I wanted to be. I remember people telling me, doctor, nurse, healthcare, medicine, something respectable, something impressive, something my parents could proudly tell people about at church. And because I loved them, I nodded. When you're young, you think making your parents proud is the same thing as making yourself happy. It isn't, but sometimes it takes years to understand the difference. I graduated high school near the top of my class. My mother cried. My father shook my hand. Everyone talked about nursing school. It had already been decided. And if I'm being honest, I tried. I really did. Because people always assume someone who leaves a path must have hated it. I didn't hate nursing. I hated becoming someone I wasn't. The first semester was difficult. The second was worse. I studied constantly. I memorized terms, passed exams, finished assignments, and every night I felt something I couldn't explain, a heaviness, as if I was walking deeper into someone else's life. At first I thought everyone felt that way. Maybe adulthood was supposed to feel wrong. Maybe everybody woke up with anxiety. Maybe everybody sat in parking lots before class, trying to convince themselves to walk inside. I didn't tell my parents. My mother would say I was stressed. My father would say to work harder. So I learned to smile. That's something daughters become very good at, smiling through futures they don't want. During my second year, I started working at McDonald's. My parents hated the idea. My mother said people would think I needed money. My father said it would distract me from school. But I wanted my own paycheck, my own savings, my own decisions. I started at the front counter. Eventually, I learned everything: drive-through, scheduling, inventory, training. Within 3 years, I became a shift manager. And for the first time in my life, I felt competent. People listened to me. Problems got solved. The work made sense. I wasn't pretending. One evening after closing, one of my coworkers asked me something simple. So when you graduate nursing school, what kind of nurse do you want to be? And I froze, because I didn't know. Not emergency, not pediatrics, not surgery, not oncology, nothing. There wasn't a single answer, because the truth I had been avoiding finally arrived. I didn't want to become a nurse. I sat in my car after work for almost an hour, rain hitting the windshield, parking lot nearly empty. and I said the words out loud. I don't want this. Sometimes your life changes very quietly. No arguments, no dramatic music, just one sentence spoken to an empty car. I don't want this. That sentence terrified me, because it wasn't really about nursing. It was about disappointing everyone. At that point, I still believed my parents loved me more than their expectations. I was about to find out I was wrong. Tell me something. Have you ever stayed somewhere simply because you were afraid of disappointing someone? Because that's exactly where I was, stuck between the life I wanted and the people I loved. And I hadn't yet realized that those two things were about to collide. The following semester became the hardest of my life. I would sit in lectures and hear almost nothing. I studied because I was afraid to fail, not because I wanted to succeed. There's a difference. My grades stayed high. Everyone thought I was doing well. My parents bragged about me. Relatives asked when I would graduate, and every compliment felt heavier, because every person who said they were proud of me was proud of someone who didn't actually exist. One afternoon, I walked into the student advising office. I don't even know why. Maybe because I was tired. Maybe because I wanted one person to tell me I wasn't crazy. The advisor was a woman in her 50s. She asked how I was doing, and for some reason I told her the truth. Everything. The pressure, the anxiety, the fear, the guilt, the feeling that I was building a life that belonged to someone else. When I finally stopped talking, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she said something nobody in my family had ever asked. "What do you want, Emily?" I started crying, not because I was sad, because I genuinely didn't know. I had spent so much of my life becoming what other people needed that I had forgotten how to answer the question. She waited. Eventually I whispered, "I don't think I want to be a nurse." She nodded. No disappointment, no anger, no lecture, just a simple nod. And then she said, "It sounds like you've already made your decision." Those words changed my life, because for the first time, somebody gave me permission to listen to myself. I walked out of her office carrying withdrawal forms, and for the first time in years, I could breathe. I didn't know it yet, but those papers would become the most expensive pieces of paper my family had ever seen. Because the moment my parents found out, everything would change. And by the end of that week, my mother would call me an embarrassment. My father would call me a disappointment, and I would begin planning my escape. My mother called me a disappointment while my father watched through a phone screen and agreed with her. My name is Emma Carter. I was 20 years old, standing in the doorway of my childhood bedroom while my mother told me I had ruined her life, wasted her money, and embarrassed our family. She said she had spent years telling everyone how proud she was that her daughter would become a nurse. Then she looked me directly in the eyes and said, "And now I have to tell people my daughter quit because she's lazy." My father was 300 miles away on FaceTime. He didn't defend me. He didn't ask why. He simply nodded and said, "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." That night, I filled out the withdrawal papers anyway. 3 years later, my mother introduced me to a neighbor and said, "This is my daughter Emma. She's the one who always knew what she wanted." Funny how parents rewrite history when the ending embarrasses them. But to understand why I packed my life into 2 trash bags and left home before sunrise, you need to go back to the day I told them I didn't want to become a nurse. Welcome back to Stories of the Unbroken, the place where the people everyone underestimates finally tell their side of the story. If you've ever been called selfish for choosing your own future, tell me where you're listening from and answer this question in the comments. Should a child live the life their parents planned, or the life they choose themselves? I'd genuinely like to know. I was 19 when I started nursing school. My mother cried the day I got accepted, not because I was happy, because she was. She called every aunt, every cousin, every woman from church. "My daughter is going to be a nurse." She said it the same way some people talk about winning the lottery. My father printed my acceptance letter. My grandmother framed it. For a while, I tried very hard to become the person everyone had already decided I was. The problem was that nursing never belonged to me. I liked medicine, I liked helping people, I liked learning, but every morning I woke up with a feeling I couldn't explain. It felt like I was borrowing someone else's life. By the second semester, I stopped sleeping. By the third, I started crying in parking lots. During clinical rotations, everyone around me seemed certain. I wasn't. And when everyone else talks about their future with excitement while you feel dread, you begin to believe something is wrong with you. I thought I was weak, lazy, ungrateful. Exactly the things my parents would later call me. The truth was simpler. I was 20 years old and trying to live a dream that belonged to somebody else. Around the same time, I was working at McDonald's. Most people hear that and stop listening, but that job taught me more than college did. I had worked there since high school. Eventually, I became a shift manager. I trained employees, handled inventory, solved problems, managed schedules, worked double shifts, closed the restaurant at midnight, opened it again at 5 in the morning. I discovered something surprising. I liked organization. I liked systems. I liked solving problems. I liked operations. Sometimes I'd stay after work talking with the store manager about costs, staffing, deliveries, and supply chains. I became more interested in how businesses worked than how hospitals worked. For the first time in months, I felt excited about something. That frightened me, because it wasn't nursing. And in my family, not becoming a nurse wasn't simply changing majors. It was betrayal. The third week of the semester, I sat alone in my dorm room. My textbooks were open, my laptop sat beside me. I hadn't read a single page in nearly an hour. Instead, I had searched, what if nursing isn't for me? Thousands of results appeared. Students changing majors, doctors leaving medicine, nurses becoming teachers, people starting over, people surviving. I read stories for nearly 3 hours, and somewhere between strangers on the internet and my own exhaustion, I finally admitted something. I didn't want to do this anymore. The relief came first. The fear came immediately after. Because realizing you want a different life is easy. Telling the people who built their identity around your old one is much harder. I called my father first. He worked out of town. He answered on the second ring. "Everything okay?" I said. "Dad, I don't think nursing is right for me." Silence. The kind that arrives before a storm. "What do you mean?" I explained carefully. I said I liked medicine but didn't love nursing. I said I wanted to explore other careers. I said I didn't want to waste money pursuing something I couldn't commit to. He interrupted me. "This is because somebody put this idea in your head." "No." "Your friends?" "No." "That boyfriend?" "No." "People at work?" "No." He sighed heavily. "This is a phase." I was sitting on the edge of my bed staring at my shoes. "I'm serious." "No, you're emotional." "I'm not. Everybody gets overwhelmed." I remember looking out my dorm window. Students walked below carrying backpacks. The world kept moving. My father kept talking. Eventually he said, "You'll thank me later." And I realized something. He wasn't listening to me. He was arguing with the daughter he wanted me to be. The next morning I met with an academic advisor. She was kind, older, the kind of person who has watched hundreds of students fall apart in her office. She listened, asked questions, waited. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "It sounds like you've already made your decision." I started crying, not because I was sad, because she was the first adult who believed me. She explained the withdrawal process, refund deadlines, changing majors, taking time off, options, actual options. Nobody had offered me options before. At home, there had only ever been one road. Nursing, success, pride. Anything else was failure. I walked out carrying withdrawal papers. My hands were shaking, but for the first time in months, I could breathe. I texted my father. "The advisor thinks changing programs is the right decision." He never answered. My mother did. "Come to my room." If you've ever had parents who say your feelings are wrong before you finish speaking, you probably already know what happened next. But tell me this in the comments. Have you ever realized your dream belonged to somebody else? And don't forget to tell us where you're listening from tonight, because sometimes strangers thousands of miles away understand us better than the people sitting in the next room. My mother's bedroom smelled like perfume and laundry detergent. My father's face was already on her phone screen. They had prepared this. She sat on the edge of the bed. He appeared in a small rectangle, and I stood in the doorway like a defendant entering court. My mother spoke first. "Tell your father what you told me." I did. Her face changed immediately. "You are embarrassing us." My father shook his head. My mother continued, "I have told everybody you're becoming a nurse." I said quietly, "I don't want to become one." She stood up. "What do you want then? Business? Working at McDonald's forever?" "I don't know yet." "You don't know because you're confused." My father finally spoke. "She's lying." I looked at the phone. "What? You've thought about this for 2 days because your grades are good." I wanted to laugh. Good grades. The reason my grades were good was because I was terrified. Terrified of failing. Terrified of disappointing them. Terrified of proving that maybe I wasn't enough. My mother pointed at me. "You need help." I stared. "Excuse me?" "You are not thinking clearly." Then came the words that stayed with me, the words that would follow me for years. "You are a disappointment." My father nodded. My mother said, "Your father is very disappointed in you." And suddenly, I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a failed investment. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in my room. My withdrawal forms lay on my desk. My phone buzzed. It was my boyfriend. He asked one question: "What do you want?" Nobody in my family had asked me that, not once. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed, "I think I want to leave." And for the first time, the idea felt less like running away and more like surviving. I didn't leave that night. That's the part people never understand. When someone finally realizes they're unwanted in their own home, they don't usually pack a bag immediately. First, they stay. They make excuses. They tell themselves things will calm down. They convince themselves their parents didn't really mean it. I did all of those things for 3 more weeks. And every day after that conversation, my parents found a new way to remind me that I had become their disappointment. If you're listening right now and you've ever stayed somewhere long after you stopped feeling safe, tell me in the comments. How long did you stay? And where are you listening from tonight? Because sometimes the strongest people are the ones who survive places they should have left much sooner. The next morning, my mother acted as if nothing had happened. She made coffee, watched television, asked me whether I wanted eggs. People imagine family conflicts as screaming every day. Most of the time they aren't. Most of the time they're much quieter. A cold shoulder, a sigh, a comment across the dinner table, a reminder, a punishment that doesn't look like punishment. My mother became very good at those. Whenever relatives called, she'd say things like, "Emma is still figuring out what she wants," or "Some people aren't ready for adult responsibilities." If neighbors asked about nursing school, she'd answer before I could. "She's having a little phase." My father called every evening. The conversations all sounded the same. "You need to stick with it. Everybody hates school. You'll regret this. You're throwing your future away." Nobody asked why I was unhappy, only why I was refusing to make them happy. Work became my escape. McDonald's wasn't glamorous. The floors were sticky. The fryers were loud. The dinner rush felt like surviving a tornado. But when I walked through those doors, nobody called me a disappointment. My employees respected me. The store manager trusted me. Problems had solutions. Schedules got fixed. Orders got completed. At home, everything felt broken. At work, I knew exactly who I was. One night after closing, my manager stayed behind while I counted drawers. She looked at me and asked, "You okay?" The question nearly broke me, because sometimes strangers notice your pain faster than your own family. I finally told her everything. Nursing, my parents, changing majors, the disappointment. She listened quietly. Then she said, "You know you're good at this, right?" I laughed. "Fast food?" "No, management." I had never considered that before. Nobody had. My parents saw a temporary job. My manager saw a future. Sometimes your life changes because one person notices something everyone else ignored. 2 days later, my mother came into my room holding my work schedule. She had been cleaning or snooping. In my family, the difference was often unclear. She placed it on my desk. "I think you should quit." I looked up. "What?" This job is putting ideas in your head. I actually laughed. She wasn't joking. My father agreed. They had already discussed it. The job was the problem. The boyfriend was the problem. The advisors were the problem. The school counselors were the problem. Everyone was the problem except the possibility that I knew my own mind. My mother sat on the edge of my bed. You've changed. No, I haven't. Yes, you have. I wanted to say something I had been thinking for weeks. Maybe I hadn't changed. Maybe I had simply stopped pretending. But I didn't. Because children of difficult parents become experts at silence. That weekend, my boyfriend picked me up. We drove nowhere, just around town, windows down, music low. I finally asked the question I had been avoiding. What if they're right? He looked at me. About what? What if I ruin my life? He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, what if staying ruins it? The answer scared me because I already knew it. I submitted the withdrawal paperwork the following Monday, alone. I remember every detail, the color of the office carpet, the sound of the printer, the woman behind the desk, the click of her keyboard. She took the forms, stamped them, and just like that, 18 months of nursing school ended. No ceremony, no speech, no dramatic music, just a rubber stamp. Part of me expected lightning, or regret, or panic. Instead, I felt something much stranger, relief, the kind that arrives after carrying something too heavy for too long. I walked outside, sat in my car, and cried harder than I had cried in years. Not because I failed, because I had finally chosen myself. I didn't tell my parents, not immediately. That probably sounds terrible, but if you've ever lived in a house where honesty becomes ammunition, you understand. I needed time to think, time to plan, time to breathe, because I was beginning to understand something. Changing majors wasn't the real issue. Control was. My parents had imagined my future, and I had walked away from it. For some families, that's adulthood. For others, it's betrayal. My boyfriend's mother invited me to dinner one evening. She had always been kind, the kind of woman who asks questions and actually waits for answers. At one point, she looked at me and said, "You seem tired." And again, I almost cried. We sat in her kitchen after dinner. I told her everything. The disappointment, the arguments, the pressure, the fear. She listened quietly. Finally, she said, "You know, home is supposed to feel safe." Nobody had said that to me before. Safe. Not successful, not impressive, not perfect. Safe. She looked at me for a long moment. "If you ever need somewhere to stay, you can call me." I nodded. I thanked her. And I immediately told myself I would never need that. People like me always believe we can survive one more argument, one more week, one more month, until suddenly we can't. The next explosion happened on a Thursday. My father had come home. My mother had apparently told him everything. I walked into the kitchen and immediately knew. Both of them were sitting there, waiting. My father folded his arms. "Did you withdraw?" I said nothing. "Emma." "Yes." My mother's eyes filled with tears, real tears, which somehow made everything worse. "We spent thousands of dollars." "I know." "We sacrificed for you." "I know." "You didn't even ask us." I looked at them. "I tried." My father stood up. "No, you informed us." His voice grew louder. "You think you're an adult because you work at McDonald's?" I felt myself shrinking. The same way I had felt as a child. The same way I always felt around him. My mother spoke softly. "You've embarrassed this family." There it was again. Embarrassment. As if my life existed primarily for public relations. That night, I sat in my bedroom. The house was quiet. I could hear the television downstairs. I opened my laptop. I looked at apartment prices, roommate listings, jobs, programs, community colleges, supply chain degrees, business management, laboratory sciences, possibilities, actual possibilities. And for the first time, leaving became real. Not dramatic, not rebellious, necessary. My phone buzzed. My boyfriend. "If you decide to leave, you won't be alone." I stared at the message. Outside, rain had started falling. Inside, I could hear my parents laughing at something on television, and suddenly I realized something painful. They had already moved on from the conversation. I was the one carrying it. I was the one lying awake. I was the one wondering whether I deserved to exist differently. They would sleep fine. I wouldn't. The decision to leave didn't happen during a fight. People imagine those moments wrong. They imagine slammed doors, screaming, suitcases, rain, but most people leave quietly. The real decision happens much earlier. It happens the moment you realize you are no longer trying to build a life. You're simply trying to survive one. For me, it happened on a Sunday afternoon while I was folding laundry. My mother was talking on the phone in the kitchen. I wasn't listening. At least, I wasn't trying to. Then I heard my name. She laughed, and she said, "I don't know what happened to her. She used to be such a good girl." The words weren't even angry. That was the worst part. She sounded disappointed, almost embarrassed, like I was a broken appliance, like I was something that had once worked properly. I stood there holding a towel and realized something. My parents weren't waiting to understand me. They were waiting for me to become who I used to be. And that person no longer existed. If you've ever heard your own family talk about you as if you weren't in the room, tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're listening from tonight, because sometimes the loneliest place in the world is your own house. The following week became unbearable. Every conversation returned to nursing. Every meal became an interrogation. My father called constantly. My mother repeated his opinions. My job became another battlefield. "You should quit. Managers at McDonald's don't have careers. You're wasting your potential. You've become lazy." The strange thing about hearing criticism every day is that eventually you stop arguing. You become tired. You conserve energy. You survive. At work, I smiled. At home, I disappeared. I started spending extra time in the parking lot before going inside. 20 minutes, 30, sometimes an hour. I would sit with the engine running, looking at the house, trying to gather enough strength to walk through the front door. That's when you know something is wrong, when home becomes the hardest place to enter. One evening my boyfriend asked, "Have you told them about moving?" No. Why? Because I was afraid. Not afraid they would throw me out, afraid they would convince me to stay. Children spend years learning how to surrender, even grown children, especially grown children. The breaking point came on a Friday. My mother had discovered apartment listings on my laptop. I still don't know whether she looked accidentally or deliberately. Again, in my family, the difference was often small. She was waiting when I came home. My father was on speakerphone. I knew immediately. My stomach dropped. She held up the printed pages. "What is this?" I said nothing. She asked again, "Are you planning to move out?" My father's voice came through the speaker. "Answer your mother." And suddenly I was 20 years old, but somehow 12 again. I sat down, because my knees had started shaking. "I've been thinking about it." My mother's face changed. Not anger at first, fear, then anger. "You want to leave us?" "No." "Then why are you doing this?" "I can't live like this anymore." My father laughed, actually laughed. "Live like what?" I looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen where birthdays happened, Christmas mornings, homework, family dinners, and I realized nobody there understood the question, because to them, nothing was wrong, only I was. "I can't do nursing," my mother interrupted. "We know." "I don't know what I want yet." My father said, "Then stay here until you figure it out." "I need space." My mother's eyes filled again. "You have a home." And that sentence nearly broke me, because technically she was right. I had a room, a bed, food, electricity. But home and shelter are not always the same thing. The argument lasted nearly 2 hours. Voices rose, doors opened, doors closed. At some point, my mother said, "We gave you everything." At some point, my father said, "You're throwing your future away." At some point, I said, "I'm unhappy." Nobody answered that part. Nobody ever answered that part. Around midnight, the house became quiet. My parents went to bed. I sat on my bedroom floor. The apartment listings were still open. My phone buzzed. My boyfriend. "Do you need me?" I looked around the room. Posters, books, school supplies, photographs. The bedroom of a girl who had spent her entire life trying to make everyone proud. And I finally admitted something. I wasn't staying because I wanted to. I was staying because I felt guilty. Guilt is one of the strongest locks parents can place on their children, and love often becomes the key that opens it. But sometimes survival does. At 1 in the morning, I called my boyfriend. He answered immediately. "I think I'm leaving." He was quiet. "Tonight?" I looked toward my bedroom door. I could hear the air conditioner, the old clock downstairs, the house breathing around me, and for the first time I realized I no longer belonged inside it. "Tomorrow morning." I barely slept. Around 4:30, I turned on my lamp. I opened my closet, and then I discovered something strange. I didn't own much. A few clothes, shoes, books, photographs, a blanket my grandmother gave me. The rest suddenly seemed unimportant. I didn't have suitcases, so I used trash bags. 2 black trash bags, the kind people use for garbage. I remember crying when I realized that, because it felt symbolic, like I was throwing my old life away. Or maybe because I felt like one. Disappointments leave carrying trash bags in movies. Successful children leave with luggage. At least that's what I thought then. As the sun started rising, I heard footsteps. My mother. She stopped in my doorway, looked at the bags, looked at me. Neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, "You're really doing this?" I nodded. She sat down on the edge of my bed. For a moment, she looked less like my mother and more like a frightened woman. "What are people going to think?" That question, even then, even now, not, "Are you okay? Are you scared? Do you need help? What are people going to think?" I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I answered honestly. "I don't think I can live my life for people anymore." She started crying, and somehow that made me cry too, because despite everything, she was still my mother, and I was still her daughter. Love doesn't disappear when relationships break. Sometimes that's what makes them hurt. My father called while I was loading my car. His voice was cold. "If you walk out that door, don't expect us to rescue you." I stood in the driveway. The morning air was cool. Birds were beginning to sing. My hands were shaking. "I never asked you to rescue me." Long silence. Then, "You're making a mistake." Maybe I was, but staying had become one too. I put the second trash bag in the trunk. My boyfriend arrived. My mother stood at the front door. My father was still hundreds of miles away. And I looked at the house where I had spent 20 years trying to become somebody else's daughter. I wanted someone to stop me. Part of me still did. I wanted my mother to say, "Stay, we'll figure it out." I wanted my father to say, "I trust you." Instead, there was only silence. And sometimes silence is an answer. As I backed out of the driveway, my mother called my name. I rolled down the window. She stood there in her robe, crying. And she said something I would think about for years. "I hope you know what you're doing." The truth? I didn't. Not completely. But enough time had passed. The sharp edges had softened. People were standing in the backyard. Coffee, cookies, small talk. And then a neighbor I didn't recognize asked my mother, "Which one is your daughter?" My mother smiled, and she pointed at me. "This is Emma." Then she said the sentence that nearly stopped my heart. "She's always known what she wanted." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard. Always known? The disappointment, the embarrassment, the daughter who ruined her future? I looked at her. She smiled proudly, as if the previous years had happened to someone else, as if history itself had quietly rewritten itself. And maybe that's what parents sometimes do. They edit the story to survive it. Later that afternoon, I asked her, "Why did you tell them that?" She looked confused. "Because it's true." I almost laughed, but I didn't, because suddenly I understood something. She needed that version of the story, the version where her daughter succeeded, the version where things worked out, the version where she had supported me. Admitting the truth would require admitting she had been wrong, and some people simply don't know how to do that. My father and I speak now, carefully, politely, like two people learning a language neither of them grew up speaking. One day he asked me, "Do you regret leaving?" I thought about the trash bags, the tears, the guilt, the fear, the apartment, the nights wondering if I had ruined everything, and I answered honestly, "No." He nodded. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "You seem happy." It wasn't an apology. My father doesn't really have the equipment for apologies, but it was the closest thing he'd ever given me. And sometimes people can only offer you the tools they have. I still think about that morning, the two trash bags, my mother's tears, my father's warning, the sunrise, the fear. I remember believing I was walking away from my future. In reality, I was finally walking toward it. The strangest part? The people who called me irresponsible, immature, confused, emotional. Those same people now tell relatives how independent I am, how hardworking I am, how determined I am. Success doesn't always change people. Sometimes it simply gives them permission to rewrite what they said about you. If you've ever been called selfish for choosing your own life, I want you to remember this. You are not responsible for becoming the person other people imagined. You are responsible for becoming yourself. Sometimes those are the same thing. Sometimes they aren't. And when they aren't, somebody usually gets disappointed. Let it happen. Because disappointment is temporary. Living somebody else's life can last forever. My mother once called me an embarrassment. Years later, she introduced me as the daughter who always knew exactly who she was. The truth sits somewhere between those two women. One was afraid, one was proud. Both were my mother. And I finally learned that I didn't need either version of her to approve of me before I approved of myself. That's where I'll leave you tonight. One bedroom, two trash bags, one sunrise, one daughter who finally chose her own future, and one family still learning that love and control are not the same thing. If this story spoke to you, tell me, at what moment did you finally choose yourself? And don't forget to tell us where you're listening from. This is Stories of the Unbroken, where the people who were called disappointments, failures, embarrassments, and mistakes finally tell their side of the story. And sometimes, years later, the people who doubted them don't even remember they ever did. I'll see you at the next story.